Welcome back to our FBI Hate Crime video series. Here at In-Synch Systems, we're excited to take you on a deeper dive into how your hate crime submissions work. We've already made it through the ups and downs of the different bias definitions, but the one main thing we need to know is how we determine something is truly a hate crime. Luckily, the FBI has provided us with some guidance and criteria to help us make this decision. To review, the FBI UCR program collects hate crime data regarding criminal offenses motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Since we're dealing with subjective motivation, agencies should only report a bias if the investigation reveals enough objective facts that a reasonable and prudent person would conclude that the offender's actions were motivated by bias. Just because an offender is biased against the victim's actual or perceived race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity does not mean that a hate crime occurred. The offender's criminal act must have been motivated by their bias. Motivation is subjective. It's difficult to know 100% of the time if a crime resulted from the offender's bias. Relating facts against the criteria provided by the FBI, particularly if these facts fall under multiple criteria categories, supports a finding of bias. Criteria 1. The offender and victim were of a different race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. One example is an African American victim and a white offender. Criteria 2. Bias-related oral comments, written statements, or gestures were made by the offender, indicating their bias. This would happen if the offender shouted a racial slur at the victim. Criteria 3. Bias-related drawings, markings, symbols, or graffiti are left at the crime scene. Swastikas painted on a synagogue, mosque, or LGBT-centered door are an excellent example. Criteria 4. Certain objects, items, or things which indicate bias were used. Offenders wearing sheets with hoods covering their faces, or leaving a burning cross in front of the victim's residence would strongly suggest bias. Criteria 5. The victim is a member of a specific group that is overwhelmingly outnumbered by other residents in the neighborhood where the victim lives. Criteria 6. The victim was visiting a neighborhood where previous hate crimes were committed and tensions remained high against the victim's group. Criteria 7. Several incidents occurred in the same locality at or about the same time, and the victims were all of the same race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Criteria 8. A substantial portion of the community where the crime occurred perceived that the incident was motivated by bias. Criteria 9. The victim was engaged in activities related to their race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. For example, the victim was a member of the NAACP or participated in an LGBT pride celebration. Criteria 10. The incident coincided with a holiday or date of significance relating to a particular race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. For example, Martin Luther King Day, Rosh Hashanah, or the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Criteria 11. The offender was previously involved in a similar hate crime or is a hate group member. Criteria 12. There were indications that a hate group was involved. For example, a hate group claimed responsibility for the crime or was active in the neighborhood. Criteria 13. An established animosity exists between the victims and the offender's groups. Criteria 14. The victim, although not a member of the targeted racial, religious, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity group, was a member of an advocacy group supporting the victim group. None of these criteria are a one-shot deal. There's no silver bullet or exact definition here. A reasonable person looking at all the information gathered needs to view it against this criteria and determine that the crime was definitively motivated by bias. Other factors, even those not previously mentioned, may play a role in deciding whether a hate crime occurred. Any facts that provide clear evidence that the offender's bias motivated them to commit the crime are applicable. Agencies must also look out for misleading facts. If an offender used a racial slur, but the offender and victim were the same race, no bias would apply. They also must be alert to evidence left by the offenders, which is meant to give the false idea that the incident was motivated by bias. Suppose students of a religious school vandalize their school, leaving anti-religious statements and symbols on its walls, and hope that they will be excused from attending class. In this example, the offenders didn't commit a hate crime. Another crucial concept is that the offender's perception matters. Even if the offender was mistaken about the victim's race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, the offense is still a hate crime as long as the offender was motivated by bias. If a heterosexual man walking by a bar frequented by gay men was attacked by 6 teenagers who mistakenly believed the victim had left the bar and was gay, then it is still a bias-motivated crime. If a further investigation reveals contrary findings to a previous determination of bias, agencies must update the FBI UCR Program file with the new classification. This update goes both ways. If no bias was initially reported and was later changed to a racial bias, an agency should update the UCR Program file. If an agency initially says a racial bias was involved, and later changes this to a religious bias, this change also needs to be reported to the FBI UCR program. An item of particular note is that this is the agency's determination only. They should not update their report based on the findings of a court, coroner, jury, or prosecutor's decision. Using the information outlined in this video, determining your bias-motivated crime should now be more manageable. It also gives you that extra information you need to back up your determinations with information straight from the FBI. Now that we know how to determine if it's a bias-motivated crime, we'll dig into the submission file next month, starting with the incident segment.